This is the Horse Radio Network.
This is episode 14 of Equestrian Legends. Hello, I'm Chris Stafford, and my guest today is show organizer, journalist, press officer, historian, art collector, and author, Switzerland's Max E. Ammann. Max E. Ammann was born on October 18, 1938, in Ammann, Switzerland. The eldest of 7 children, his family used horses on their farm near the German border, which presented him with an opportunity to ride and drive at an early age, and whilst the rest of Europe was engaged in World War II. His career began in commerce and moved to journalism, during which time he was chief editor of the Luzerner Tagblatt, Swiss American Review, and L'Année Hippique. He served as foreign correspondent in New York for Swiss, German, and Austrian newspapers, during which time his attention switched to equestrian sports coverage. Max was the co-founder and first president of the International Alliance of Equestrian Journalists in 1974, which he saw as a need to improve relations with horse show organizers, a role which he put into practice as press officer for numerous international shows, including 6 Olympic Games, World Equestrian Games, and World Cups, amongst others. He also served as president of the Swiss Press Association. As an organizer himself, he founded and advised international shows and served on multiple committees. He was instrumental in founding the FEI World Cup Series for jumping and driving, and also the World Breeding Foundation and International Jumping Riders Club. He continues to serve as a member of the FEI Appeals Jury for several European shows. As an historian, Max has published the history of the equestrian events at the Olympic Games 1912 to 2008 and the history of world, continental and regional FEI championships. His lifelong love of art has involved him in the Foundation for Naive and Outsider Art in St. Gallen, Switzerland, and he is the author of 4 books on art in German. Max was awarded a gold medal for World Cup jumping, Equestrian Personality of the Year by the International Jumping Riders Club, and Press Officer of the Year by the International Alliance of Equestrian Journalists. The Max E. Ammann Trophy is awarded annually to the winner of the Jumping World Cup qualifier at the Helsinki International Horse Show. Max and his wife Corinne live in Bern, Switzerland, and have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. You have done so many things in your life, mainly in the horse world, and typically we know the full name of the guests on the Equestrian Legends show, but there's a story behind your middle initial, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, because I don't have a middle name. At that time in Switzerland, it wasn't necessary to have 2 names, so most of them, including myself, have only 1 name. But funny enough, when about 1956, when I was very young, I had a small job in La Chaux-de-Fonds, which is the French part of Switzerland. And when I entered the office, I was greeted with a name, starting with the E. It was just a habit of the company that everybody got another name. And so I was called during these few months I was there with this first name E. Then I forgot it. And then when I came to the United States in 1964, and I filled in the immigration papers, and it says middle initial. And I hadn't had one, and so I remembered the E, and so I put in the E. And it became quite important because I was a foreign correspondent in New York, and in the newspaper, you are, at that time, in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, for whom I wrote, they published a lot of my articles under the initials. So instead of M.A., Max Ammann, they published M.E.A., and that looked very good. And when I came back to Switzerland, I became chief editor of a daily newspaper. they called me either the chef or Mea, M-E-A.
You will forever be known as Max E. Ammann.
That's right, that's right.
All right, well, born in Switzerland and now currently living in Bern, you've accomplished so much. I wonder what occupies your time and what motivates you now at this time of life?
Yeah, I'm still interested in the history of the equestrian sport. I wrote in 2006, I wrote the book, The History of All the FEI Championships, including the Pan American Games and the North American Young Riders Championships. And then I wrote The History of the Olympic Games. The book should come out next year. But in addition to that, the history of the equestrian sport, I'm very much interested in art. And our collection is just traveling at the moment. It was shown this year, in a museum in Switzerland. And now in February it will be shown in a museum in France. And in August it will be shown in a museum in Germany. And
that, of course, is naive and outsider art that you're particularly interested in.
That's right. That's what we collect, yes.
So how long have you been collecting art?
Since I'm a boy, because I grew up in a small village on the Lake of Constance, and that village was quite famous for its painters. 3 of them lived in the village, and there were always visiting painters. At that time, the artists didn't work in the ateliers thinking of something spectacular. At that time, they went out to the nature and painted nature. And so I met a lot of artists, and one of them took me more or less under his wing and took me to openings and to art exhibitions, and that's how I started to buy art when I was, I think, 18 or 17.
Wow. Now, do you paint yourself?
No.
No?
No, I mean, no. I don't think that opera critics have to sing. And but I think all 3 children we have are quite talented in painting and doing art.
Obviously, that's a very fascinating occupation outside of the horse world. We're going to talk a lot more about that and all the things that you've done in the horse world. But first, I want to visit your early days, Max, because you mentioned you were born in the north of Switzerland, Mattingen in Switzerland, in 1938. Of course, this was just on the verge of the outbreak of World War II. Those early days as a young boy growing up of a large family, tell us what you remember.
I think I grew up because it was a village on a lake with a big forest behind it, so I spent a lot of time in the forest, a lot of time on the lake. And of course, since I was born just before the outbreak of the war, I experienced the war because across the lake you see Germany, and I remember in the last 2 years of the war there was a bombing of Friedrichshafen, of Schaffhausen, and that you could hear and see part of the fire that came. And I remember, and that's probably one of the last things I can clearly remember, I was standing, just going to school on one of my first days in 1945, when somebody told me that the war was over, which I believe was 8th of May 1945.
And there was some accidental bombing, I believe, wasn't there, of Switzerland by Germans, and they invaded the airspace of Switzerland continually, didn't they, at that time? It was an interesting period for Switzerland because obviously it was a natural refugee destination, although I believe Switzerland was very strict about the number of refugees it took. Did you feel any of the fallout, if you will, of World War II in terms of the refugees and the Switzerland's situation within Europe?
I think that the Swiss were scared because they knew they were a little island in the middle of the war. Germany in the north, Austria in the east, Italy, who was an ally of the Germans in the south. France was occupied by the Germans, so we were surrounded by not our friends. And so I think the Swiss were scared. And I'm sure that in the early years of the war, the Nazi, they had plans to invade Switzerland, because I'm sure that this little white space in the middle of Europe was a sore spot for them. Also, maybe the Switzerland was also a good place to exchange spies and news and money and merchandise.
Yes, I seem to remember it really was a haven for espionage. And there was some irony, wasn't there? Because the Swiss were making aircraft parts for German aircraft that were being aggressive to them. So there was a certain irony, wasn't there?
No, the irony was, I think, we had a big weapon factory in Zurich, the Bürle, and they made a very famous, what we call flap, a cannon that shot down airplanes, and that one was sold to both sides.
Yes.
Which is not a good sign for Switzerland.
No, indeed. Well, very early memories for you growing up in war-torn Europe, but somewhat protected. Tell us about your parents, Max and Francisco. What do you remember of the family relations in those early days with having a large family at that time?
Yeah, but the large family wasn't so visible because, we had a big farm, not cows, but horses, and my father had two businesses. One was local transport, which was at that time done with horses, and secondly, he bought all the fruits and vegetables from all the farmers within, 20 kilometers, and sent it and sold it to the big markets and the big shopping centers in Zurich, St. Gallen, etc. So there was a big house, was a big barn. There was always things to do, so it was not so that we stayed for, so the seven of us in a small apartment.
Were you expected to have any involvement with the horses then, if it was part of the family business? Was that your earliest involvement with horses, Max?
Well, I think at that time you were expected to do work. And as I said, we didn't have cows, but we had horses, so they had to be fed. And so we had big fields. We had to go there to hay and to whatever, was grown, the potatoes. So you were expected to help. That was normal. And since at that time the whole horse transport was done, the whole transport, including picking up the fruits and the vegetables from the farmers, was done by horses, I was part of the driving people. So I drove, I would say, on every afternoon I didn't go to school, I drove horses.
Wonderful picture there, Max. So driving would be the first thing you learnt probably before you started riding, was it?
Yeah, driving, I didn't drive for pleasure. I drove because my father asked me, and then I enjoyed it. Right. Riding was something else, because on Sunday my father sometimes said, well, today we are going riding. And then, because our horses were always rather light horses, there were Oldenburgs or Hanoverians or Holsteins, and so you could drive them during the week, and on Sunday you could ride them.
Wonderful. Now, what about your siblings and your mother? Were they interested in horses at all?
I would say much less. They also were much younger. I was born in 1938, and then the first brother, Walter, was born in 1947. And the last one, Rolf, was born in 1955, so they were much younger. So when Rolf became a young man where he could help, at that time I had already left home. I was already in the United States.
Well, let's talk about those early days of your education before we talk more about your horse involvement and how you got on later in life to doing the things that you've done in the horse world, Max. But first of all came school, of course. Were you a keen scholar? Were you interested as a student, or was it just something you felt you had to do?
No, I think I was a good student, at least in primary school and in secondary school, because I think it went without much effort. The whole school. No, I had no problem with the school.
And they were, of course, all in Ermatingen.
They were in Ermatingen, yes.
Yeah. And then you went on to commercial school as well. Now, how did that come about, Max? Did you decide what you wanted to do with your career at that point?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was in 1953 you start thinking what you do, and I thought maybe I become a teacher. And then, of course, because I was so involved in my father's business, I also helped him with the bookkeeping. The most intelligent thing to do was to do a commercial school, especially at that time. My brothers and sisters were still young or not even born, and so I didn't know what they would do, but here I was with the knowledge of the business, with the knowledge of the horses, so it was the most logical thing to do a commercial school.
So from commercial school then, how did your interest develop to doing the things that you've done with horses? As I said in my introduction, you've been a press officer, a journalist, an author, historian, of course, and you've founded so many or co-founded so many organizations. How did you transition, Max, from commercial school and the early days of your career into the horse world?
Yeah, I think there are two things. One thing is that of course, I went, in 45, my father started to compete with 4 horses and with the 4 in hand driving, and I went with him. I was more or less the groom in the beginning, very small, and then a little bit bigger. And so I was always involved in horses or horse competitions, and I was never a spectator as such. From 1945 on, I was a part of a competing man, and later on I became a journalist. And the second thing was that during my commercial school, I was already interested in many other things, and I started to go to the local paper and ask if I could write little things.
So early days of journalism then, combining your love of horses, as so many equestrian journalists do. But then you became a foreign correspondent. Tell us how that came about when you traveled to the US.
Yeah, as I said, I did a commercial school, and then since my father was still fit and everything, I worked at the different places. I went to La Chaux-de-Fonds in the French part. I went to Hamburg in Germany, where I worked. And one day I decided to go to the United States. And at that time, it was not so difficult to get a visa because you still had the United States still had the immigration laws of, I believe, 1928 or 29, where the Anglo-Saxons from Europe, which the Swiss were considered part of it, had quite a quota. So I got a visa, and I went to the United States. And on my learned job in transport, commercial transport, but also with already connections to some newspapers, and I started to write.
Now, did you have any involvement with horses directly at that time, Max? Were you riding or driving? Did you go to competitions?
No. Don't forget, I got, after my army in 1957, I got very ill. I got paralyzed, and so I couldn't ride anymore. Or I could ride maybe, sitting on a horse and walking around, but I couldn't do any jumping or anything anymore. So no, I didn't compete. The only thing I went to horse shows. First, my father when he was competing, and later on when I started to write about it as a journalist.
And of course, that began an incredible career as a journalist, and you were, of course, the co-founder and first president of the International Alliance of Equestrian Journalists. You were chief editor of the Swiss-American Review, the Luzerner Tagblatt in Lucerne. So many roles that you played, and also your role as press officer. That, must have been a very interesting period, because it was at the time when a lot of organizations were being formed, and you were the catalyst of that. You were founder and managed the FEI World Cup jumping at a time when sponsorship was becoming so important to the sport. Do you remember the struggles that you had in those early days, Max?
Yeah, I remembered how badly the press was treated in the 60s and in the early 70s, because there were horse shows like Rome. They couldn't care less about the foreign press. They only cared about the local press, and so it became. And I also realized that many sports that had not existed before, like rhythmus gymnastic, or sports who had played a very small media role, like tennis, like golf, like curling, had become much more aggressive. Especially tennis, for example, who until 66, when it became professional, had played a very small role in the media. And of course, the loser were the sports who did not be aggressive like those others. And one of them, and probably the most prominent one, was the equestrian sport. And so in discussions in the 70s with my colleagues, with riders, we realized that unless we do something to get the media interest back, the equestrian sport will fade into a third-class niche sport.
I'm curious, Max, how you made that transition from the mainstream media into the equestrian media to become obviously as passionate as you were and a catalyst for change.
Yeah, when I was in New York, I earned my money and to pay my bills with writing about politics and a little bit about Broadway, about the opera, about culture, about general themes. But I also always, from 1964 on, when I went to the United States, I wrote about the equestrian sport. I went to Gladstone, to the United States Equestrian Team Center, every year 4 or 5 times. I met Steinkraus, I met many of those people. And so I wrote, partly for sports magazines, for like the Schweizer Kavalleries in Switzerland, for Hufslach in Holland, for Information Hippique in France. I wrote about the equestrian sport already in 1964, and I continued that until I went back to Switzerland in 1973.
Of course, this was the days long before the internet and electric typewriters. Were you writing on an old typewriter and then telephoning in your copy?
At that time, you telephoned. For example, when I was at the World Exhibition in Montreal in 1967, I telephoned that to Zurich, and but mostly you either telex or you send it by airmail.
By airmail?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So what was the type of deadline that you had then, Max, in those days, if you had to rely on airmail?
Yeah, I think you didn't send I think the report, let's say, from a meeting at the United Nations, you sent by telex, and you had a telex available at the United Nations. What you sent by airmail were general articles about the railroads, about and a preview of an election campaign, or a review of an opera or of a play on Broadway that you sent by airmail.
Fascinating, of course, and you've watched the evolution of equestrian journalism today. How do you regard those early days and how it did affect the changes that it has today, Max? You must have a very clear picture of the intervening years.
Yeah, I think what struck me what struck me later when it got lost was the fact that in the 60s until the early 70s, most major newspapers in Europe had an equestrian correspondent, and then the first countries who were to abolish them were the Germans, and and those who kept it to the end were the British. So you always had Alan Smith for the Daily Telegraph, or you had Pamela McGregor Morris for the Times. But the Germans from 1975 on didn't have their own correspondent. They used stringers or people from the horse magazines to ask them to send them a small review in the evening, or they used the agencies. In some countries, it never reached the mainstream, like in the United States. In some others, like in France or in Germany or in Switzerland, certainly the equestrian sport has lost space. In others, like Sweden, Finland, it has gained. It has a lot to do with success.
Well, I want to talk about now about the other roles that you've had in equestrian sport. As I mentioned a few moments ago, you were founder and a director of the FEI World Cup, and you were not obviously content just to be a journalist. You wanted to get on the other side as well.
I think if you read my early 1970 articles or reports on horse shows, you will realize that I didn't really write that David Brun won because he was faster than Harvey Smith. But I wrote also the background. What motivates the people to run a horse show? How do they finance a horse show? How much are the prices of the horses in relation to the prize money they can earn? So those things have always interested me. And as I said, the loss of space or airtime of the equestrian sport worried me, and so I started to think what could be done about it.
And you certainly did, and you got into event organisation, horse show organisation, and I think you're still involved to some extent today, aren't you?
When I retired from the World Cup in 2003, I simply said I was writing those books mentioned before, the history of the championship, the history of the Olympic Games. So I said to myself and also to the FEI, I can only write books about the sport if I still continue to go to horse shows. So I'm now on the appeals committee on about, no less, but in the beginning about a dozen horse shows all over Europe, and that keeps me informed.
It certainly does, and you obviously have been very involved in the engine room, if you will, of the FEI committees, involved with so many of those. I'm curious as to, when you look back at the changes that you have witnessed, Max, what are the strongest memories of all, from driving to jumping, and breeding, of course, the breeding program that has obviously been very effective now with the World Breeding Federation, which you co-founded. How do you reflect on your time being so active in the sport and the changes that took place?
Yeah, I would say that the equestrian sport in the beginning, in the 60s and 70s, or even earlier when my father, the horse show, was still very much a military sport, and the military didn't need media and didn't need exposure. And I think that the big thing was really that in the 70s, and then in the 80s, 90s, the riders or the athletes, if you want, became more visible, and the horses became more important. And so I would say that, but of course, the problems came parallel. The doping, the medication misuse, the abuse of the horse. So I would say that, and so in a way that the equestrian sport is like any other sport, exposed to public scrutiny.
And of all the riders, of course, that you've watched throughout their careers in the different disciplines, Max, could you pick out any over several decades now that have inspired you and you've considered to be outstanding horsemen and women?
Yeah, my favorite rider certainly is Billy Steinkraus. Because in addition to being a great rider and a great horseman, he was a great companion. He was the president of the World Cup Committee for many, many years, and we traveled together to Australia, to Japan, to South Africa, to many, many places together, to Moscow, and talked. And a lot while we ate and drank. And so he was certainly also a great influence on my thinking. Others, I think I had always a good relationship with the Brits, with Harvey Smith, David Boom, John Whittaker. Then I would say with Markus Fuchs, the Swiss. Then in Germany, I had my battles with Paul Schockemöhle. And so I would say yes, I had I met a lot of interesting people among the riders.
And in terms of the driving, obviously with your interest and involvement as a boy in the driving world, you will have seen the sport of four-in-hand develop to where it is today with such international acclaim, of course, not least of all now as part of the World Equestrian Games. That must be a sense of great pride and joy for you to watch the growth of that sport.
I think when I got the idea of doing a World Cup, originally the idea of a World Cup for the drivers, for the four-in-hand drivers, was to do it on outdoor events. But soon we realized that the differences between Aachen and let's say a show like Beekbergen in Holland, there are huge differences in prize money, huge differences in demands and so on. So I settled on a World Cup for indoor shows, and I would say the reason behind it was to bring driving, four-in-hand driving, to a new public. I had realized that when you go to Apeldoorn or to Aachen driving or to Breda or to Beekbergen or to Windsor, the people watching there are mainly the driving insiders. And for example, if you go to a World Championship in Holland, among the 30,000 who are walking the marathon, they come specifically because they like driving. But so I thought with an indoor World Cup, doing in connection with the Jumping World Cup at the major shows like Geneva, like Bordeaux, like any other, that you could attract new public and to show how dramatic and powerful driving is to the new people.
And it certainly is now. It's certainly proved to be a very popular and exciting sport that has been brought to a wider public, thanks to your efforts, of course, founding the FEI World Cup Driving. And your role as the press officer, Max, you have literally been all over the world wearing your hat as a press officer. I'm curious from that side of the desk, of all the experiences that you had. You must have also had some very funny moments too. Can you recall anything that is fit for broadcast?
First of all, I must say that the FEI, it took the FEI a long time before it realized what that is a press officer. In other words, I was in the early Olympics, like Montreal, I was rather representing the Alliance of Equestrian Journalists and then the FEI. The FEI didn't know what to do. And even in '92, when we had this situation with the qualifying system for the jumping final, total disaster, the FEI never thought of using me as a mediator between the unhappy journalists and officials who were more or less responsible for the disaster.
But do you have some amusing moments that you would like to share with us?
Oh, should have told me that before. Then I would have thought of it.
There must be so many, Max. I think this should be part of your autobiography. Now, speaking of books, as you mentioned, you've written so many books. You've been an historian of equestrian sport now for many years, and of course, you've also penned many media guides as part of your role too. And you mentioned that you're writing the history of the Olympic sports too. Of all those titles, does something else come to mind that you want to write now after you finished your next book? Do you have a schedule of what's left to be written?
Maybe I'm writing a little book about little anecdotes. I have some of them. And I like to tell you now one about Hugo Simon. Hugo Simon is the first winner of the World Cup. Mm-hmm. And in 1974, we had the CSIO and the Ladies World Championship in La Baule in France. And on the Sunday afternoon, in addition to the competition in the arena, there was a TV, and on TV they showed the final of the Soccer World Cup. And Hugo Simon, who even loves soccer more than horses, sat in front of the TV. And suddenly the loudspeaker said, and the next rider is Hugo Simon. And he was sitting in front of the TV. So he ran down, sat on the horse, jumped it was Flipper, a very fast horse, and came back. And then again, maybe an hour later, the loudspeaker says, we are coming to the prize-giving ceremony led by Hugo Simon. So he had won and had not cared. So again, he jumped on the horse and got his money. A lot of German and Austrian riders love football, unbelievably.
I hope his team won then, I hope it was worth the diversion. Well, you, of course, have watched, I don't know, countless numbers of rounds, both dressage, jumping, eventing, driving. It would go on and on for a long time, Max, recounting, and that in itself would be an interesting story. But I'm going to ask you to pick out of all those major competitions that you've been to around the world, maybe some memorable moments. What stands out right now when you think about some of those great rounds?
Yeah, actually, I was asked that question, which were your greatest horse shows you ever experienced, and I chose 3, and I can tell them now. The first one was 1970, the World Championship in jumping in La Baule in France, just 4 years before Hugo Simon did his act there. And I think that was the first competition of where television was live, where a lot of journalists came. And of course, it was the first World Championship Olympic Games held in Europe after 10 years, because in 1964 the Olympics were in Japan, 1966 the World Championships were in Argentina, 1968 the Olympics in Mexico. And so in 1970, for the first time in nearly 10 years, show jumping came back to Europe on the world level, and that was a huge success, and for me one of the most beautiful horse shows I ever attended. The second major thing I really liked were the first World Equestrian Games of 1990 in Stockholm. They were very well organized and had a lot of charm and, in a way, a certain innocence, which probably they don't have today anymore. And the third one, which I really liked, were the Olympic Games of 2000 in Sydney. They were very efficiently organized, very friendly, and so the 2 weeks in Sydney were really a pleasure.
And of all the things that you've done in your life, Max, of which accomplishments would you be most proud of now when you reflect on them?
Yeah, I would say that more or less all the things I started, which means Lani Hippig, which means the Journalist Alliance, the World Cup Driving, the World Cup Jumping, the International Jumping Riders Club, which I co-founded also, I think they're still alive and kicking.
And apart from your writing now, as you mentioned, the book that you're writing on the history of Olympic Games, what is a typical day in the life of Max Ammann now?
Yeah, I mean, I have to compare it with earlier. In let's say, 20 years ago, I came home from a travel on Monday or Tuesday, and I left again on Thursday. So in between, I tried to organize my life, pay the bills, and you know, as I said, kiss my wife and count my children. Now it's different. Now I stay a lot at home, and mostly I'm concerned with our art collection, so I work a lot with that. And also I organize a little bit all the things I have accumulated over all these years. But aside of that, so either I read a lot or I travel. I still travel. I go, so like we were in Geneva, now we go to Basel, then in January comes Leipzig, and then in April comes Hertogenbosch in Holland. And when you travel, then, then you are away for a week or even more, except 20 years ago I went by airplane, now we all go by car.
Yes, it's so convenient, of course, being in Switzerland. Now, you mentioned your wife, Corinne, of course. You married in 1969. Does she travel with you now when you go to these shows to make sure that you come back?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, I think just about 15, 20 years ago, in the early 90s, I switched from the airplane, at least in Europe, to the car. It happened that, at that time I needed at the airport, I started to need a wheelchair, and so and that's not so much fun because you rely on other people to go to the gate. And at the same time, our children had left the house, so my wife had the time and to come with me. So I would say since 1995, my wife more or less comes all the time with me.
And you mentioned that you read a lot, Max. What type of books do you read?
Yeah, it depends. In the bed I read pocket books, novels, criminal stories, old and new, from Dashiell Hammett to the new ones. And so I read a pocket book a day if I'm home. And then when I sit in the living room like I do now, then I read art books or I read horse books.
A student of equestrian sport, aren't you? I think it always will be.
Yeah, if I get one, like Geneva published at the occasion of its 50th anniversary, it published a book done by Alban Poudret, and I'm reading it.
And have your children and grandchildren inherited any of your horse interests?
Not the horse interest, but I would say the curiosity to do things. Of course, they love to come to horse shows because at the horse shows they got pocket money, they got to meet big riders, they got to live in a nice hotel. So they always loved horse shows. But and Ralph for a few years worked for me. And actually, during that time, I sent him for 3 weeks to Gladstone. He worked for 3 weeks as a volunteer in Gladstone. And but now they each has their own job. Ralph is an event manager, Christian is a lawyer, and Denise is a PR marketing person at the bank. And so they all have their own life. And but if they come to horse shows, Ralph goes every year to Helsinki. They have been in, even the grandchildren, they have been in Mechelen, have been in Göteborg, in Leipzig, in Geneva, in St. Gallen.
And when you reflect on the principles and the values that your parents bestowed upon you, Max, what would you hope to pass along to the next generations?
Yeah, probably what has guided me, that you have to be open to everything, you have to be curious, but you have to work hard. And if you are a big cheese at 40, you still have to work that you are a big cheese at 50 or at 60.
My final question to you, Max, at the end of the day, when you close your door, what matters most to you?
That also I'm probably a difficult person. I didn't hurt too many people.
If you had a message to people in the horse world, what would it be, knowing what you know now?
Watch it that the sport doesn't disappear, because scandals. Like in football or in Formula One racing, car racing, whatever happens there, it's minimal against the space the sport gets in the media or the airtime. While in the equestrian sport, if you have one or two scandals of doping, medication misuse, or abuse of the horse, then the danger is that those stories take more space than the sport itself, and that's a danger. Because if the public opinion starts to believe that in horse sport there's more cheating than real sport, then that's the end of it.
Well, Max, it's been a very interesting and very varied life, and I want to wish you luck with your future publications. We hope we'll be able to read those, not least of all your anecdotes, as well as your continued study and historian account of equestrian sports. Thank you so much indeed for sharing your memories of your life with us.
Well, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure, and thank you.
Please join me again next time when we visit the life of another equestrian legend.